life after death. And how many of us have been skeptics, non-believers, thinking when you die, that is it? Our special guest on Beyond Belief, too, was a skeptic, but things changed for him. Things changed dramatically with his after-death experience.
He says he has glimpsed the divine, an orb of light, brighter than a million suns, all-powerful, all-loving, a being beyond words. Dr. Eben Alexander recounts his remarkable near-death experience in the New York Times bestseller, Proof of Heaven, a neurosurgeon's journey into the afterlife. In 2008, Alexander suffered a meningitis-induced coma and nearly died. The out-of-body experience he had in that state is proof that consciousness is independent of the body. Alexander continues to probe consciousness and looks to transcend the limitations of the brain in his latest book, The Map of Heaven: How Science, Religion, and Ordinary People Are Proving the Afterlife.
Now, that's pretty fascinating. So welcome to Beyond Belief, Dr. Eben Alexander. What a, should I say, life you've had?
It's been quite a life, especially when you realize, as I often say, no one gets out of here dead. That's really the truth of the matter.
Eben, tell me a little bit about the skepticism that you had prior to these episodes.
Well, I had grown up in a family with my father having a tremendous influence on my life. He was the head of a neurosurgical training program, very scientific. He also had a very strong faith in God. For him, there was never any doubt when he operated on a patient. The patient did well. It was really God's work. I grew up in the 60s and 70s. And like many others in that generation, I always knew that science is the pathway to truth.
Sure.
And I had wanted to believe what I heard in church, growing up in a Methodist church in North Carolina. But 20 years spent in neurosurgery, I just wasn't sure how conscious awareness could survive the death of the brain and body. And of course, that's why my experience, which happened back in November 2008, shifted everything, because in fact, such a severe case of gram-negative bacterial meningitis should have disabled all but the most rudimentary aspects of consciousness, and yet my consciousness was greatly enhanced during the experience when the human part of my brain, the neocortex, was being devastated. And that completely violated everything I'd learned in neuroscience about consciousness in the brain, and it really has come to show me that the material is wrong, and in fact it's parallel to a lot of what's happening today in the notion of philosophy of mind and understanding of consciousness that makes much more sense. And that's what Proof of Heaven and Map of Heaven are all about.
Back in St. Louis, the county executive at the time, Buzz Westfall, came down with meningitis, and they put him in an induced coma while they were trying to get him well again, and he just never came out of it. It was a horrible situation. And I've always wondered, Eben, that when you're in that state of unconsciousness, is the mind really still moving? Are you dreaming? What's going on at that point? And what is he seeing when that's going on?
Well, I think that the interesting thing is when you finally begin to understand, as much of our current science is coming to understand, that the physical brain is not creating consciousness out of physical matter, but there's something much more perplexing going on. Whereas in fact, the brain should better be viewed as a reducing valve or filter. It's interesting, but we're conscious in spite of our brain.
Right.
The neocortex, I believe, is the part that actually handles a lot of that filtering mechanism. But consciousness is something that's allowed in. Consciousness, from my point of view, is primordial. Consciousness pre-exists the entire universe, and in fact, all of the material universe is built on the substrate of consciousness as fundamental. And that's why the current revolution in kind of brain science and the mind-body discussion is so interesting and of so much power to all of us, because it's showing us what quantum mechanics has tried to show us for 100 years, which is consciousness is fundamental in everything that evolves in this universe.
We've had arguments on Coast to Coast, my radio show, with scientists about that very question, that without the brain, does consciousness still exist? And some hard scientists will say, no, you've got to have the physical brain in order to make this happen. But I agree with you. I think that it exists outside of the physical realm, doesn't it?
Right, exactly. And this is something that we can come to see, especially those who are with patients who die. That's where the real action is. If you want to find out what's going on, talk to hospice nurses, nurses in ICUs, things like that, because they got this a long time ago. They see enough evidence when a patient passes over that it's not simply the end of everything when a physical body dies, but it's actually a release of the soul. And in fact, what I would say is that conscious awareness is greatly enhanced when it's freed up from the shackles of the physical brain, completely outside of space and time. It's a much richer, more profound existence. Sure. And yet the interesting thing is that when we come into these bodies, because I believe that it all has to do with reincarnation. We don't just, have one incarnation and then it's heaven or hell forever, right, and that's the end of it. But in fact, we come back again and again in our process of ascendance. But the interesting thing is how we forget. There is that forgetting. Now, children, I think, are very much walking in two worlds. Very young children, they're living in that spiritual realm and in this earthly realm.
They remember a little better
They
than
remember,
we do.
and it's amazing to see. And if you're open to that, you start to realize that in infants and young children, that they are seeing these, other aspects, other beings, and it's something that our culture, unfortunately, kind of drills out of us. And that's to the detriment of Western culture, because other cultures, of course, have maintained that knowledge of a continuity and the eternity of soul. But our Western culture, especially under the yoke of scientific materialism, has lost that sense of the nature of reality.
Eben, tell us a little bit about this experience that happened to you, the moment you got sick, and then what happened when you finally came out of it?
Well, it all started, it's important to point out that my near-death experience, although it has many of the hallmarks of other kind of deep transcendental NDEs, it has one fairly atypical feature, and that is that I was amnesic for the life of Eben Alexander in the midst of it all. And that all served a major purpose. It took me months and even years to really appreciate. But in essence, it all started in what I call the earthworm eye view, very primitive, coarse, unresponsive realm, like being in dirty jello with roots or blood vessels all around me. And that seemed to go on for a very long time. Now, when I first came back to this world and wrote it all up, I thought that earthworm eye view, as I called it, was simply the best consciousness my physical brain could muster when the neocortex was being destroyed by bacterial meningitis. The good news is that didn't last forever. I was rescued by a slowly spinning, very clear white light with fine gold and silvery tendrils coming off of it, and it had a perfect musical melody. And as it came towards me, slowly spinning, it opened up like a rip in the fabric of that ugly earthworm eye view, that coarse realm, and led up into this brilliant ultra-real valley, what I call the Gateway Valley. Now, it's gateway because it was only kind of the entry point to multiple levels going all the way out to the core. But that, I believe, that Gateway Valley is the same realm that I believe all spiritually journeyers into the spiritual realm over thousands of years have encountered that same thing. And it's often put together, and then we come back with some of our prior beliefs and our personal mindset kind of shaping it, and our words and language reflects that. But in fact, when you read many of these accounts, thousands of these accounts, what stands out are the similarities. Now, in my particular case, that Gateway Valley, I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. There were millions of other butterflies, and they were flying in these looping spirals, and they were of colors beyond the rainbow.
Jeez.
And they
it's
would
like being in a kaleidoscope.
It was very much like a kaleidoscope, and then flying down into that lush greenery. This valley was absolutely fertile, rich, lush, with life and creation, no sign of any death or decay. And going into that, I remember sensing the flowers, buds, blossoms on trees. Everything was always opening, dynamic, blooming, creative, blooming, every bit of it. And down below in this valley were thousands of what I called my early writings villagers. They were souls between lives, lots of joy and dancing, merriment, children playing, dogs jumping. I mean, incredible festivities, and it was all being driven because up above were these golden orbs of light swooping, leaving sparkling trails against that blue-black velvety sky, and all the scene lit by these billowing clouds of color. And in fact, the best part about it was I wasn't alone. And everything I witnessed in that realm, there was a partner. on that butterfly wing, who I came to call my guardian angel, a beautiful woman. And I'll never forget how she looked at me, how she was sitting, how she was dressed, the same kind of peasant garb as...
Did they have wings?
No, she didn't have wings, but she was sitting there with me. We were sitting on what I interpreted as butterfly wings or a magic carpet or whatever, but something like that. But she was just sitting there looking as angelic as could be, but no wings. And her message to me, I believe, is such a central part of the message from the book Proof of Heaven to this world of my story, which is you are deeply loved and cherished forever. You will be taken care of. You have nothing to fear. And those are the most fundamentally important lessons of the journey. And I remember this soft breeze that blew through that in my early writings I called the breath of God or divine wind. And that was my first knowing. Remember, I was completely amnesic for anything of Eben Alexander's life. No words, no language, no religious concepts, none of that. So that soft breeze was my first awareness of the divine and of the infinite loving power of the divine through every bit of this. The lower four-dimensional space-time realms, this gateway valley, which actually had a completely different temporal flow and causality. And all of that going on, what happened next was, once again, the angelic choirs, the music, sound, vibration, provided yet another portal up into higher and higher levels. And I remember going through several levels of spatial and temporal dimensions until I got out to what I call the core. The core, infinite inky blackness, but filled to overflowing with that infinite healing power of unconditional love of the Creator for the creation.
This just illuminated you.
It absolutely did. Illumination is a beautiful word to use because, in fact, the paradox of that core realm, of that oneness, it's kind of like the event horizon of a black hole, where you're right on the very edge. And going into that oneness, there is nothing but the infinite oneness, all of eternity, all of infinity, the core driver of all that is. But at that event horizon, you can start to sense how it all gets parceled out into the incredible theater of drama of sentient beings throughout this universe that are living these lives, discovering these lessons, teaching these lessons. And you end up seeing how this is all really soul school. But the most fundamental lessons, of course, have to do with that unconditional love and coming to realize that unconditional love has infinite power to heal at all levels, whether you're talking about the individual soul, the soul group, nations, all of humanity, all on life on earth, all the sentient civilizations throughout the universe. That love has infinite power to heal.
We're with Dr. Eben Alexander, author of Proof of Heaven and Map of Heaven, and he experienced something just truly remarkable. Now, we went out on the streets to talk to people about life after death, Eben. I want you to take a look with me at some of their comments.
Okay.
Here we are.
I don't really think so.
I believe in heaven, so yes.
It's not really clear what it may be, but I believe in some sort of life after death.
I am not certain about the afterlife. Don't know.
Like, I think we split into a million little souls, kind of like sand on a beach, and then it kind of collects into rocks, which is like the incarnation of our being.
I believe what you do during your life affects what you become in your afterlife, but it's your physical body that dies and your soul lives on forever.
Well, Dr. Alexander, what we just saw seemed to be a mixed review of whether there is life after death. Why do you think so many people aren't in that position that you're in and I've been in terms of a belief that there is life after death? You had a lot of people there that just weren't quite sure.
Well, I think it's in large measure due to our culture. And we look at scientists as the arbiters of truth. Scientists have largely told us that the material world is what is real. That's what we're here to study. The most fundamental field in science in many ways is physics. And of course, physics has built in that assumption that the only stuff that is in this universe is the physical world. And that's part of the problem, because in fact, what I would say is my journey showed me very clearly, and this is where I see the whole scientific world going, that we live in a spiritual universe.
Yes.
from the very top down, bottom up, however you want to look at this, we are in a spiritual universe that is absolutely alive with the spiritual nature of who we are and what we're here to do and what this is all about. The material world is actually just the stage setting. It's the backdrop. It's like the facade in a Western. You know, when Hollywood goes out to shoot a Western, you've got all the fronts of the buildings there and makes it look like that old town. That's what the physical reality is. But in fact, what's really going on is a drama that has everything to do with sentient beings being here to learn and teach these lessons and the ascendance and evolution of consciousness. That's what's really happening. So focus on physics in the material world is really just focus on the stage setting. But each and every one of us are truly eternal spiritual beings. And I think that's the most important lesson. And our whole culture will shift dramatically as we come to incorporate this. And it's really being forced on us by the truth, by the facts. Because if you try to subscribe to pure scientific materialism or physicalism, you know, that the physical is all that exists, you end up running into major problems. One of the biggest problems, of course, is the measurement problem in quantum mechanics, which the physics community has struggled with for more than 100 years. And the way out of that issue is through realizing that we are spiritual beings. The consciousness is fundamental at driving this entire universe, and yet our physicists, some of them, have a little difficulty letting go of the simplicity of pure physicalism.
Well, you know, I'm impressed that you've taken a scientific look at what happened to you, and you're coming up with those answers that those people who have been very spiritual since the beginning of time have always told us. And that is, there is life after death, and it's out there. Now, during this experience that you had, did you witness, and it seemed to be illuminating, as we talked about, and enlightening, and wholesome, and heavenly, but did you have any glimpse of what could have been conceived as hell?
Well, I would say if I had gone into my experience and just been through that earthworm eye view and come back to this world, I would have had a hellish NDE. Very simple and straightforward. And, you know, the thing is, I cycled many a time. I would go up sound vibration frequency, always offering the portal, the gateway. And I think that's an important point because, of course, we've used sound in chants, in the resonance of ancient structures, etc., to drive spiritual journeys forever. And so sound was a crucial part of it, but I came to realize that this was very much, you know, a spiritual journey that that had no other explanation. I'm sorry, I'm
I
needing
assume
to focus right on your question.
In your human life, you were a pretty decent guy. You were a good person. If you weren't, would that hellish experience have been more magnified?
Well, I think that's the other important point, is life review, you know, your life flashes before your eyes, is not a new age concept that just has come up in the last few decades of near-death experiences. Because in fact, near-death experiences go back thousands of years across all cultures. And the life review is a crucial thing to understand. I mean, the near-death experience of the Armenian soldier reported by Plato. You know, here's a soldier way back 2,300 years ago who came back to life after a near-death experience, and his message was, when you go there, what happens is you review your whole life, and the only thing that is important, as he put it, is the love that you have manifested. So what I came to see in my journey is very clearly that unconditional love is the straightest path of ascendance towards oneness with the divine. And we each have that free will to make the choices in our lives of love, compassion, forgiveness, acceptance, mercy, or otherwise. And that's why I said in Proof of Heaven, you can do no wrong. But when I say do no wrong, what that really means is be willing to face the consequences, to reap what you sow. That life review would look like hell to anyone who has spent much of their life dishing out pain and suffering to others, has been greedy and selfish, egocentric, fully self-focused. That's a guaranteed recipe for a pretty hellish life review that then tends to rectify and kind of get you going in the right direction. And remember that in that life review, The judgment is from our higher soul and soulmates. It's not from some higher being, although when you've been to the core, to the one realm, what you realize is all of consciousness is one. We are all part of that one consciousness. And that one universal consciousness is what is driving all of this evolution of consciousness. But there's no need for an eternal hell.
When you came back, and we'll put it like that, did it change you?
Everything changed. Now, first of all, important to point out, my doctors were right. My meningitis was so severe and had destroyed my neocortex so effectively that when I first started to wake up in the ICU room, I had no memory of Eben Alexander's life before. All I remembered was where I had been in this journey. And it had happened over 7 Earth days, because that's how long my coma was. But if you'd asked me then, how long did all this last? Months, years, I don't know. It's a very extensive odyssey that I was on. And I think that's a very crucial thing to understand. My brain was wrecked, but I didn't even recognize my loved ones at the bedside.
How did you contract this?
We never found out. My doctors, in Proof of Heaven, I talk a little bit about some very interesting facets because I had recently been to Israel a few months earlier. And
you were fine?
And I was fine. Yeah. I was fine. So we never figured out how I contracted it. It was a deep mystery. It was a 1 in 10 million diagnosis, having E. coli meningitis in an adult. That almost always happens in newborns.
Something you ate?
Well, no, we just never figured it out. So all I can say is I'm very blessed to have this recovery. It was a tremendous gift, in fact, because that kind of destruction of the neocortex blew away all the simplistic little pseudo explanations that modern science or medicine would try and slap onto my experience, and yet there's no way to explain that kind of rich, ultra-real experience that I had in the Gateway Valley and the core, given our general ideas that the brain produces consciousness. It's impossible. You have to turn it around and look at the other way around, which of course applies so well to so many other near-death experiences too.
I envy your experience, but I don't envy what you had to go through to get there.
Well, the good news is I try and go back there all the time. And what I often tell people is you don't have to die or almost die to come to see everything that I know about this. I meditate an hour or 2 a day. This is why I do that work with Sacred Acoustics, to try and help people get the tools, because all you need to do is be a sentient being. If you're conscious, you can go within consciousness. Once you realize the brain does not create consciousness, but that consciousness creates all of this world, then you start to realize that slipping beyond the veil that is created by the physical brain and getting into that universal and infinite consciousness might offer up some real wisdom. So that is why I encourage people to meditate. Take 20 minutes, an hour, 2 hours a day if you can. That's what I try and do. Go inside. Realize that that voice in the head is not consciousness. Your consciousness is aware. It's the observer of that voice. But we are all far grander than simply that one little voice in the head. We are the observer of that. In fact, all of that is interconnected. And that's why that work with Sacred Acoustics, I think, is so important to help get these tools out to the world.
Did you get close to the point where you thought you may have met God?
I would say I not only met, but became one with God. That is what happens in that core realm, in that oneness. Wow. Now, what the problem is, when you say that kind of thing in this world, people want to lock you up or put you on medication, give you some Prozac or something and try and calm you down. But the fact of the matter is, the way I see it now, our consciousness is an absolute and direct link to that creative deity, to that infinite oneness. And we can all come to know that. And obviously, you leave ego far, far behind in this whole thing. The boundaries of self are false. And that is what this is all about, is coming to a deeper wisdom of what consciousness truly is, and coming to see that we are all connected, not just with other human beings, but with all sentient life throughout the universe and with everything in our world, all other animals. It's all about that consciousness, and we're all manifestations of that consciousness. Humans are not the pinnacle of anything, as much as we try and put ourselves up on that pedestal. I've found that the only thing that humans do that makes them special is they cook. but it's not about the language. It's really not. Our language actually is an impediment. Kind of the rational mind, the voice in the head, so tightly tied to ego, gets in the way of this kind of journey and understanding. But through deep meditation, releasing those false boundaries of self and the ego and all of its little fears and concerns, we can actually come to much greater wisdom.
Okay, let's find out what some of you have to say about consciousness.
Consciousness is a daily question, right? We don't really know.
I kind of think collective consciousness, like raising awareness and everybody kind of becoming more attuned to one another.
Being able to talk with and experience life with other people, knowing that you're awake and having thoughts and feelings that are different from other people.
Joseph Campbell describes it as being like a leaf turning towards the sun, and I think that's an apt way. That's what I think consciousness is.
We all have heavy dreams that seem real, so who's to say that's different than this life that we're living every day? It's something I question all the time.
That was fascinating, watching people like that. But we get people that write in. They write into you at info@ebenalexander.com. I want to read a couple of them to you, Eben, and have you answer them for us. Jane from Nashville, Tennessee. She said, Eben, I read your book, which is way above my thinking. In your book about heaven, if you were there, you didn't mention Jesus or saints or disciples. Would you be so kind as to tell me what church you attend, and do you believe in having communion?
Well, I grew up in a Methodist church, and what I would say is my journey showed me very clearly that God that I met on my journey and have come to know so much more through meditation and centering prayer, that God loves all. That God loves Christians, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, atheists, skeptics, bloggers. That God loves all of creation. And one of the worst problems we've had, I came to see that all the deep mystical traditions of all the great faiths, whether it's Buddhism, Judaism, Christian mysticism, Sufism, Islamic mysticism, what have you, they all converge on one knowing and one reality. It's only when we get the dogma that emerges out of the teachings for the masses that come out of the various religious systems that we start to run into all of this incredible conflict. And this sense of, oh, I'm right, you're wrong, is completely wrong. The deeper traditions that bypass the Tower of Babel approach of our dialogue and of our teachings is what gets in the way. This is why I encourage people to go within. Go within, because the deepest truth lies within, and there's great truth to all of those great faiths. But it's all about the oneness and how we are all part of one consciousness. It's important to get. And any kind of preaching of separatism is really getting away from the original messages of the prophets. So in fact, I would say that I encourage all of these faiths, as long as they are about the oneness and of compassion and of forgiveness and of the reality of that spiritual essence that is part of all of us.
Peter from St. Louis writes, Dr. Alexander, immensely enjoyed your books. Very much raised my spirits. I was wondering, though, regarding Christian beliefs, your NDE seems to not indicate any of what might typically find with the afterlife as described in the Bible. Has that changed your views or beliefs in Christianity? So another
I think it has. And in fact,
question.
What I would say about that, my amnesia, as I mentioned, was a very important feature, because when I first came back to this world, I had none of the language, none of the preconceptions, none of the religious concepts to put it together. And all of that came back over about 8 weeks, but during that time I was struggling to record my experience. And so to me, that was a real gold mine, the fact that I was amnesic. I had an empty slate. So I could go to that realm, have this experience, come back without any of the baggage that many souls do have, or bias. And I think that was important. It also is important to point out that everything that I've come to know and learn about this in all of my reading and all my meditation is that, as I said, all of the great faiths at their origin are the same. And in fact, what I came to see is the original Christianity that was taught by Christ, which is not necessarily what's there in the Bible, because people need to remember that the Bible was actually constructed by committees several centuries later.
Sure.
And they intentionally omitted several writings. And for me, learning more about the Gnostic Gospels, about the Dead Sea Scrolls, has been very important to formulate what I view as a much more complete version of original Christianity. So I don't necessarily take the version that came out of the patriarchal committees and kind of the Romans realizing, that Christianity was here to stay. I don't think that their viewpoint is quite as valid as a more global viewpoint of early Christianity and the actual teachings of Christ that I think come through some of the other writings that were not included in the New Testament. Likewise, I would say teachings of Buddha, Muhammad, I see great overlap in the love and compassion. That's what really is the deep message here, but that message was hijacked by others who tried to twist it into some of the systems of the modern world.
Okay, let's go to our final email here, Eben, for you. It's Bob from New York. Dr. Alexander, within a day, I finished reading your book. That's pretty good, by the way. Mm-hmm. It has really brought some clarity to many of the questions and helped me regain some goodness and wholeness in my life. What do you believe becomes of the evil people that we see more of ever today in our world? What about them?
Well, I would say they have a hellacious life review to go through. And one should not minimize that at all. And as I often say, you don't need an eternal hell, but a life review where you have to make amends for all the wrongs that you've done, not just in your actions, but even in your thoughts, is the kind of corrective measure that replaces that notion of eternal hell and damnation. To me, that made zero sense when I came back from my journey. For one thing, I already could see that reincarnation was such a crucial part of this, but I could also see that this is a very just universe. We reap what we sow. And that's a very crucial lesson. In the Eastern spiritual traditions, they talk about karma. And I came away from my journey seeing very clearly that you're going to end up learning these lessons of love one way or the other. We might as well do it by manifesting as much love as we can in this life, loving ourselves, because first and foremost, that's one of the most I would say the origin of so many of the world's problems is we don't even love ourselves enough. And we have to do that before we can really love others and serve as a conduit of that love of the Creator for the creation, bring that love through us. But that's what we're here to do. And the more we can follow that in this life, the better we will do in that life review. In fact, my life partner in this, Karen Newell, often talks about doing a daily review just to keep the baggage of her life review as kind of uncumbersome as possible. So live this every day. That's why these lessons are so important. They're not just about what happens when you die. This is about how to live this life. And it only comes from a much richer understanding of the spiritual beings that we are, and that this is a spiritual universe, and that's what this is all about.
If you want to write an email to Dr. Alexander, it's info@Eben, E-B-E-N, EbenAlexander.com. What do you say to people who don't believe in life after death?
I say, this is really
tough luck.
Well, no, it's okay. This is all a question of free will, and this is what God gives us as a beautiful gift. Is free will to make the choice, and we're supposed to be doing this, and we're supposed to be doubting. To me, the greatest asset in this journey is a true, open-minded skeptic. I can tell you that what my coma journey did to me early on was made me a very open-minded skeptic. I had to doubt everything.
Sure.
Just as Descartes said, if you want to be a true seeker, you have to, at some point in your life, doubt everything you've ever thought was real and start over with an open mind. And I often would say early on, I'll believe it all for now, just for the time being, because I want to try it on. You have to try these things on. Our culture is so good at kind of hammering home these kind of ideas of materialism that we can lose sight of it all. But indeed, the answers do lie within us all. So I urge people to go within, do that practice of meditation. And as sentient beings, we all have a very legitimate claim to that realm. But I do believe that souls can get stuck if they have too much doubt about it, they can get stuck at that kind of life review phase, stuck down in those murky realms of that earthworm eye view, and never really be able to ascend, because this is all part of our learning and teaching these lessons and coming deeper and closer to truth. And that is the truth, but it has to do with our waking up and facing that truth.
Would you want to go through this experience again, or would you rather just wait until that real time comes?
Well, I believe that our lives are a beautiful blend of kind of a divine plan that has everything to do with our picking. Before we come into these incarnations, our higher souls and soulmates in the soul group choose the hardships. The tough things in life are gifts, illness, injury. Before my coma, of course, I looked at all that as bad. Why do these bad things happen? Well, in fact, look at them as gifts, because that is what provides the engine for the growth of our soul and the ascendance. It's how we face the hardships, how we face those injuries and illnesses and all the other challenges in life. And if we can make choices that manifest that love and that compassion, forgiveness, love for ourselves and for others, that's what allows us to learn the lessons of the hardships and to ascend beyond them, and to realize that every step of this is about soul school, being here to learn and teach these beautiful lessons. And right now, the main lesson for humanity to learn is that lesson of unconditional love.
Are you scared of dying, Eben?
Not a bit. It's not the end. It's actually an awakening. But I have plenty to do in this incarnation.
Yeah, there's no rush.
We get things done here. We're here for a reason. As much as I often point out that the material world is the illusion, what's concrete, rock solid, real is soul, spirit, consciousness. That's real. And we're here to learn these lessons. And that's why all of it is set up in this beautiful fashion, for us to come to realize that. And realize that the brain, as I said earlier, is a reducing valve or filter. It's a prison. That our true awareness comes from going to the other side of that veil, and we can do that in meditation. Make it a daily practice, centering prayer. Bring that love for yourself in and that love for others. Come to see the beauty in the hardships, which you can do in deep meditation, and find that there is great guidance and wisdom and comfort and love deep in meditation and centering prayer.
Has this experience affected you to the point where it was very emotional for you when you come out of it? Because I would think after you go through an experience like this, not only is it an awakening as you've gone through, but that it really tells you something about the universe. And when you're part of that, when you understand it, it's got to be a feeling that it's almost indescribable.
Well, it is a beautiful feeling indeed. I think the important thing to point out is a tremendous amount of confusion in our kind of conceptualization of the nature of reality and understanding our place in it has to do with those false boundaries of self.
Yeah.
And it really involves moving beyond that. And that's why souls who are very advanced, who are far along in this incarnation process, are the ones who have completely been liberated from that notion of self and kind of the ego and all of the fear and anxiety that's built around that. And the more we're here to serve others and to bring that love in, the better it serves us to kind of have a deeper sense of this whole universe. Because anytime we feel ourselves as separate from it, we're obviously under this great delusion of our modern culture, which tries to separate out self. But in fact, by getting rid of those false boundaries of self, that's when we start to realize that that one mind and that one consciousness makes far more sense. And that's something we can certainly get to deep in meditation.
In a great movie called What Dreams May Come with the late Robin Williams, and gosh, I miss him, it really showed a different glimpse of what is out there. When you look back at what happened to you, is it something you expected? Or is it different than what you expected?
Very different. It was very, very different. The ultra reality of that realm is stunning. And you often hear about it. And people ask me, well, is it like high def TV? No, this is so much more than that. And the thing to realize is by getting into that infinite universal consciousness, by transcending that veiling function in the neocortex and the shackles of the physical brain, we're getting into that wide open territory. People, for example, who have taken psychedelic drugs have a teeny glimpse of it, because what psychedelic drugs do is they remove some of that filtering mechanism, and they allow a full onslaught of sensory information.
Maybe
but
too full.
Yes. And not only that, though, they also allow us to get in touch with that universal consciousness where you're actually lifted up out of the illusion of the here and now, of that false sense of locality that we have in these physical bodies. And so all of the information is flowing at us in tremendous fashion, plus we're becoming not only other beings, but other groups of beings, other segments of the universe as part of the lessons being shown to us. So it's no wonder that our earthly language, which of course is very good for describing a trip to Disney World, is not quite so well suited to describing these kind of spiritual journeys. That's again why I encourage people go within. The answers lie within us all. But so much of it cannot really be put into our earthly language.
So, Doctor, how is reincarnation possible?
Well, reincarnation completely defies the materialist thinking that I had before my coma. Brain creates consciousness, birth to death, nothing more, which is what I believed before coma. But I think what you have to do is get a much grander view of what consciousness actually is. And that's, there are scientific groups around the world who are doing some amazing work here. But it really has to do with this whole mind-body discussion. The mind-body debate's been going on for 2,300 years. You'd think we'd be getting close to some answers. Well, I believe we finally are. But it's through a consolidation of the greatest wisdom out of Eastern and Western spiritual traditions and the leading edges of science and technology. It has everything to do with consciousness and what it is. And when you come to realize that consciousness is what creates all this universe and not the other way around, then it starts to make more sense. And for me, it was crucial to see in my journey, I came back and knew that reincarnation was the way it all worked, but I didn't know how to incorporate that into my scientific worldview. It turns out that a lot of the scientific homework has been done. One of the biggest groups is the group at the University of Virginia, Division of Perceptual Studies, the work of Ian Stevenson and now with Jim Tucker, where they have more than 2,500 cases of past life memories in children where the best explanation is of true reincarnation. Now, it turns out it also answers many other problems. For me, that infinitely loving, powerful, and knowing God was hard to reconcile with all the evils in the world, and especially the suffering of innocents like children and animals. And reincarnation offered a very obvious solution to that and allowed me to fully see the power of that infinitely loving God, but also with all the suffering we see where by no fault of their own, these poor beings are kind of snuffed out before their time. And reincarnation is a great way to see that. Also important to point out from the viewpoint of suicide. Some people think, oh, well, my life is miserable. I want to get to the other side. Dr. Alexander says it's so beautiful. Well, the problem is suicide leads to one of the most profound life reviews you can imagine, where you come to realize the absolute depth of love that is there for the one who committed suicide. And that lesson is very strong and just is shockwaves throughout the soul group involved in that suicide. But it's all to help move to the next level. But realize that is never the end. You don't sit up there on a cloud playing a harp forever. We come back in and get it right the next time.
And again.
And again. Exactly, in that pathway of ascendance.
Sacred acoustics. What is that and how does that get involved in the scheme of things here?
Well, about 2 years after my coma, I realized that the only way to start making sense of this was to go within, to meditate, to go into my own consciousness and try and get a better idea of the landscape. Around that time, I encountered the notion of binaural beats and brain entrainment using differential sound frequencies. Now, to me, this was very appealing because the general notion, as I understood it, is that by putting slightly different frequencies into the two ears, what you end up doing is kind of hijacking a nucleus in the lower brainstem. and I won't go into all the neuroanatomy and physiology right now, but it has to do with driving the predominant electrical rhythm in the neocortex, in the information processing part of the brain. And what I found is that by using those differential sound frequencies, you can actually drive a predominant modulation of the neocortex, and in essence, I could mimic what had happened with my near-death experience, where my neocortex had been destroyed by E. coli meningitis. But I could do it temporarily in a reversible fashion by basically monotonizing the electrochemical activity in the neocortex.
You stimulated yourself.
But to a point where you're actually taking the information processing in the neocortex out of the loop and allowing your conscious awareness to take off. So these differential sound frequencies are very powerful. Binaural beats was a phenomenon first discovered in the mid-1800s by a German physiologist. People have been using them in increasing fashion. And then I ran into Kevin Cossie and Karen Newell. Karen Newell, as I've said, my spiritual partner in all this work. And they were making their own binaural beats and doing an extremely good job of it. Kevin Cossie is a master at this. And I encouraged them to form a company and to do this, bring these tools to the world, which is what they are doing. And that's why I encourage people to go there, try that out, go to sacredacoustics.com. It's extremely powerful. Now, I can't claim that we really understand the mechanisms right now. It's all very early in the understanding, but I've been able to duplicate and go back into my near-death experience, not only to recall memories, but to actively work with those beings and guides, deities. All of that incredible power of that realm is something I can access through these binaural beats, and others can do that too.
So let's take a listen at Sacred Acoustics and exactly what it means.
Relax your body, letting go of any tension. Become aware of your breath as it moves in and out.
That does have some kind of a meditation feel to it, doesn't it?
Oh, it does. Yeah, it
puts you in a different state.
It does. I highly recommend people listen through headphones. That has even more power. But I mean, just hearing that little bit through speakers, to me, it just, it obviously drives something in my own conscious awareness. You start to shape your whole mind and consciousness.
Yeah, it is
with
relaxing.
this, and it's very, very powerful.
Eben, it's always enlightening to talk with you about your experience, and I'm glad you're here. And there's no rush to get to the other side, but at least when you do, you've kind of given us a little